In the last two movies, we've been looking at functions, and in this movie, we're going to take a look at a specific aspect of functions where functions can return a value back out of them. Now, when we did the say hello function, it was actually echoing out what we told it. So it did that. It processed that request. But when we got to our addition function that we just wrote, it set a value for us, but we didn't have it echo. And we could have simply told it to echo the sum out of there. But then we wouldn't have actually needed to echo it here. We could have just said call it. And that would have worked for us. That worked just fine when we were doing the hello. But what if instead we want to get the value back out of the function so that we can keep using it and keep working with it? And that would be a case like this where we want to actually get the value and then echo it. Or let's say maybe it's even clearer if we actually say the new value equals. So we now have this value that we can work with. And then later on, we can echo it back with new val. That's what we're trying to achieve here. In order to do that, we need to return the value of sum from the function. And that's just done with simply the word return. That's the function that we're calling. We're telling the function, return this value. Now, it also is going to exit out of the function at that point when we say return. It's a lot like break was when we were working with a loop. So it's going to return out of the function with that value. So we've called the function addition. We're going to return the value sum to new value and then echo back the new value. Let's go ahead and try that real quick. We'll save the document. We'll switch back to our browser. You'll see that now it comes back and it does the addition that we were looking for. Now, it's a good idea whenever you're working with functions, especially functions that don't just do display like we did with say hello, that you're going to always return a value out of them. Just get in the habit of making sure every function has a return. And maybe all it returns is true or false based on whether it worked successfully. But you want to have something return out of the end of that function just to let you know. So we could have done the same thing here. We could have had it return true. That would be perfectly fine. It would execute, it would do its line of code, and then would return true back to whatever called it. In this case, it would just get disregarded and just keep moving on. So that's going to be a very good habit for you to get into. Now, I just mentioned it briefly. I'm not sure if you caught it, but returns can come up anywhere in a function and break you out of the function. So let's say we have a function that has a variety of if-then statements in it. It has loops inside of it. But somewhere inside one of those loops, after we finally figured out a value that we were looking for, maybe as we were going through records in a database, we find what we were looking for. We can return a value back out immediately and stop processing on the loop, stop any further if-then statements, stop anything else that was in the function, and just exit back out with that return value. So you could actually have several return values inside a function. You could have it say, if this happens, return this value. Or, if that happens, return this value. You could even have a function that had dozens of return values in it and a final return value at the very end of the function, so that if none of the others were true, none of them happened, then it would return something like false or a default value. Now, of course, if I'm returning a value, then I also have to receive the value on the other end. So here you can see, unlike say hello 3, where I just called it on its own, I actually set it to something. I set it to the variable new value so that I could echo it back. Now, if I had just instead called addition, and let's say we're going to do 5, 6, and save that, even though it's returning a value, it doesn't echo it because it didn't do anything with that value. That value got generated, was returned from the function, and then just got thrown away because it didn't have anything to do with it. So you're going to want to always catch those values as they come back. So the function will go ahead and return a value, and we're going to have something that receives it on the other end. And maybe all it receives is true or false, but then if it receives true or false, we can test that. We can use our if-then statements to say, if the return value is true, if addition succeeded. In fact, we could have said, if addition equals 11. And then we could have had something that says, echo yes. We know how to do that. Let me go ahead and take out this semicolon. I have one extra one there. So we know that that works. So it's important to make sure that you're doing something with these return values, that you're not only returning them, but that you're doing something with them. And the last point that I want to make about return values is that return values return one and only one value. If you need to return more than one value, there's a way to do that though. So let's go ahead and copy our function here, addition, and we're just going to drop down here, and we'll put it in. We'll scroll down a bit, and let's call this add underscore subtract, S-U-B-T. That's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to do both the summation and the subtraction, and I'm going to return both. So we're going to have add, we're going to make this add just so it's clear, add and subbed. And those are the two values it's going to return. This one will just do subtraction. So it'll take the two values I give it, it'll do both addition and subtraction, and right now it's going to return addition. Subtraction will just get lost. Just like it did before we actually returned a value, it just gets lost and nothing ever happens. Now we can't return more than one, so we have to choose. But what if we want both? Well, in that case, the solution is that we need to do something like result equals array. And arrays are going to be our friend here because remember, arrays simply let us take variables and put them into a single structure and assign it to a single value. And then we can return back result. So then when we get it back, we can say result array is going to equal to our add subt of, and let's go ahead and do 10 and 5. And then we'll be able to work with our result array just like we do with arrays. Let's go ahead and echo that back. Result array, and the first item will be that. Let's go ahead and give it a name so that'll be clear, because the first one we said would be addition. And then the second one, I'm just going to duplicate that line, will be what happens when we get the subtraction. Okay, so let's take one look at the code that we just wrote. I see I actually missed a semicolon here. We want to make sure we don't miss any of those. Everything else looks good. Let's go ahead and save it, and let's try it in the browser. You'll see it came back and it told me add was 15 and subtract was 5. And that is in fact true. If we add the two together, we get 15. If we subtract 5 from 10, we get 5. So that's the way that we can pass multiple results out of a function. So if we need to pass something more than just one, we can do it with an array. Now that we've talked about return values, we've seen how a function can do its processing and return a result back to whatever called the function. There's one other way I want to look at that functions can actually set variables inside the function that will have an impact on what happens outside of the function. And that's with global variables. And we'll look at that in our next movie.